This week's parsha is Parshas Vayigash. Vayigash means, and he approached. And we pick up right where we left off. Joseph has now seized Benjamin. Benjamin is now alleged to have stolen Joseph's special goblet. And all the brothers head back to Egypt. They're very devastated. They had made, especially Judah, had pledged away his life in this world and in the next to ensure that, to Jacob, to guarantee that Benjamin is going to be safe. And now Benjamin looks like it's all hope is lost. And Judah has he's a very aggressive argument that he presents here before Joseph. And this is really the crescendo of the story, because very soon afterwards, Joseph is going to let everyone know who he really is and admit it, and everything's going to shift back. I think it's really interesting to examine what's Joseph's motivation. So everyone tries to understand here. Joseph, already last week's parsha, starts this cat and mouse game where he starts playing with his brothers, telling them they're spies, imprisoning them, sending them away, bring Benjamin, who are you? I don't know this, I don't know that. Takes Shimon as a hostage, demands to see Benjamin, plays all these games by putting their money back in their satchels. And again, he does it again. And the big question everyone tries to figure out here is, what's his motivation? What's he trying to accomplish? Now, last week we suggested one approach that Joseph was trying to test the brothers to see if they have changed since they vilified him many years prior. He wanted to see, it's been 22 years since then, and there was a lot of tension between the brothers, specifically the brothers from different mothers, and he wanted to just see if that was still present. That's one approach. I had another theory last night, maybe a suggestion about what he's trying to do here. At the end of last week's parsha, so Joseph takes Benjamin, and the brothers say to him, send Benjamin back and we will all be slaves for you. What essentially the brothers are doing, all the brothers that were part of the scheme to sell Joseph, right? It was everyone besides for Benjamin. All of them are offering themselves as slaves to Joseph. They don't know he's Joseph yet. But I think it's really interesting. The brothers, they committed a horrible crime prior, 20 years prior, by selling their brother as a slave. And I think it's appropriate, if they're going to rectify that, if they're going to achieve repentance, it would be through the same process where they're saying, Benjamin should not be offered as a slave, we're guilty, and thus we really are deserving of everything that we did to you. That was last week's parsha, part of the repentance process. Joseph now, he accomplishes that. He calls them back in, and it's really interesting to highlight what he tells Joseph. And he recounts the whole story, and then at the end he tells them that he highlights Jacob. And he says, Jacob is so invested in Benjamin, and please don't make nothing happen to him. And their souls are interlocked. The souls of Jacob and Benjamin are bound up. And what's going to happen? He's going to suffer so much. And I think it's really interesting. The brothers, when they made their fateful decision to sell Joseph, well, who suffered as a result? We know, the verse tells us that Jacob was inconsolable. And the brothers didn't seem to take that into account when they made their decision. They didn't think about what's going to happen to Jacob. So really, the brothers' crime was a crime against Joseph and a crime against their father, where they didn't take into account his suffering, and they just went with what they thought was correct. So in order for them to really achieve repentance, they have to experience what they did to Joseph, and they also have to wallow in the thought of their father's suffering to fix that part of their misdeed. They initially had a total disregard, apparently, for the pain of Jacob with the sale of Joseph, and now, with the pending imprisonment and enslavement of Benjamin, they're suddenly so concerned. Obviously, they've changed and they've repented. Once Joseph sees that, he can reveal himself to his brother, because his mission of assuring that his brothers achieve atonement is fulfilled. Joseph is being very magnanimous here. He's like, we see from the end of the story, continuation of the story, he doesn't really have any animosity to his brothers, even though his brothers still suspect that he does, but truly he doesn't. And initially when he reveals himself to them, the first thing he says is that this was not your plan, this was God's plan. God sent me here to ensure that we have food and will be taking care of us and to really usher in the next era of Jewish history. Joseph finally decides to spill the beans, and he immediately announces that everyone should leave the room. Now, if you remember anything about his brothers, they were all strapping, powerful, strong men that had a tendency to sometimes use that violence without maybe properly thinking about the consequences. But the commentators point out is that Joseph is now going to tell the brothers who he is, and it's going to hit them like a ton of bricks, the mistakes that they made, and they're going to be ashamed and embarrassed, and he doesn't want to have them ashamed and embarrassed in front of the collected multitudes. This is in a throne room. There's lots of people there. Everyone is out besides for them, even though Joseph is risking what could happen to him before he lets them know what's true. What's not, we see, like Judah's, he's approaching him, he's intimidating Joseph almost. And regardless, Joseph sends everyone out, so no one else should be there when he makes himself known to his brothers. So he starts crying, and the news gets everywhere, and Joseph tells them the very fateful sentence, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers are absolutely silent. They're dumbfounded. They're struck because they were disconcerted. They couldn't look at it. They couldn't. It was too much for them to bear. And it's interesting. The very famous midrash here that compares this encounter to the one that we will have with God. It's an interesting idea. Very, very famous midrash that says that when Joseph says, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? When he says those words, and suddenly everything becomes clear for the brothers, they're speechless. They can't say anything. And the midrash tells us that in the future day of judgment and day of reckoning, it's going to be the same. Joseph is a human. He's a younger brother of the people that are assembled. And when he reveals himself, they have nothing to say. How much more so, says the Medrash, when the Almighty will reveal, so to speak, the truth to us and say upon each person what they really are, how much more so will they be left speechless? That's what the Midrash tells us. I think the lesson is like this. Joseph's brothers, they had all the justifications in the world for what they did. But these were righteous men. They weren't just consumed by anger. They were maybe influenced by anger or envy, but they had rationalizations for everything they did. Everything they were able to justify. They had excuses for everything. And you know what? In our life, with our failings, we also have excuses. Yeah, what do you mean? It's not hard for us to assemble a list of excuses for why we're not great people. It's not a hard thing for us to do at all. But then Joseph comes before his brothers and he says, I'm Joseph. I'm the ones you sold. And look at me now. Is my father still alive? Right? Everything that I had predicted that was going to happen, the dreams, they all came true. You guys have bowed down before me. And suddenly all the rationalizations for their behavior just go up in smoke, and they have nothing to say. Because what he's doing is revealing the truth to them. And the truth is that he's Joseph. Is the father still alive? I still care about my father. Did you care about your father when you did what you did? And the truth is just so clear and present before them, they have nothing to say. All the excuses suddenly have disappeared. What do you mean? You had reasons why you did it. How come you can't say them now in front of the judge and jury? Well, the answer is that when the truth is presented in this instance, there's nothing really to say. And the Midrash tells us that's exactly what's going to be like when we're confronted by God. And the words used there is that God is going to give judgment on each person exactly he's going to tell them what they are. What this means is, everyone's going to say why their excuses were valid and why they didn't accomplish what they needed to have accomplished. But there's going to be other areas of life where, despite all the resistance that we claim to have, we're able to succeed in so many other areas. People say, well, I couldn't study Torah. I was so busy. I had a couple of jobs and a family. And they might to pull out the Netflix playlist and say, okay, you're really busy. Let's look how many hours in 2016 were spent watching television. And obviously you weren't that busy. And it's not telling you anything that's not you. It's just looking at what you did, and thus it's really showing that your excuses are really just excuses. People who say, well, I don't have the mind to study Torah. It's too much information, it's too complicated. But somehow in other areas of life, they're able to wrap their heads around lots of pieces of data. Someone once said that I don't know if this is true anymore, but every 8-year-old kid knows how many RBIs and how many home runs all the players on their favorite team have. And if you actually assemble all that information, kind of write it all out, it's a staggering amount of data. So it's not that they're incapable of memorizing lots of information, lots of Torah. It's just that they choose to prioritize with their time, with their effort, with their money, with their mind, with their intellect, other things. And thus, really the excuses are just excuses, and that's what Joseph did. Joseph didn't tell them anything remarkable. He just exposed the truth. He said, is my father still alive? I care about my father. Do you care about him? I'm Joseph. This is me. And they have nothing to say because all their arguments and all the justifications go by the wayside. And the next thing he tells them is also important. They don't respond, and he tells them further, approach me, and they approach him. And he says, I am Joseph, your brother, that you sold me to Egypt. Important that Joseph is addressing the elephant in the room. It's been 22 years, but when your brothers sell you as a slave, it's probably something that you remember. And what he's saying to them is that, listen, let's address it. This could potentially cause a lot of conflict between us, but I want to put it on the table right now. You guys, my brothers, sold me as a slave to Egypt 22 years ago. That happened. Let's address it, and let's move past it. He tells them, listen, don't be distressed. Don't reproach yourself for having sold me. It was God had this plan to make sure that I'll be a provider for you. We still have a long way to go. There's 5 more years of famine ahead of us. And thus, it wasn't your decision, so to speak. It was God who sent me ahead. It was under divine supervision that this should happen. Yeah, I think it's a good lesson. Sometimes when there's a conflict, someone gets into, it's before Yom Kippur and people try to make amends. And they like to dance around the issue sometimes because it's uncomfortable for everyone involved, both the perpetrator and the victim. But sometimes it's good to just bring it out to the table because then at least the possibility exists for it to be, addressed and discussed and brought out to the open and not linger in the recesses of someone's mind and consciousness. And Joseph, he comforts his brothers and he tells them to go bring Jacob. And he talks about his stature. I'm a master over Pharaoh and the whole household. I'm a ruler of Egypt. Go to my father. Tell him, so said your son Joseph, God's made me master of all of Egypt. Come, don't delay. You live in the land of Goshen. Everyone, children and your grandchildren, and we'll have plenty. Don't live in the famine in Israel. Come here. And he starts hugging and kissing his brothers, and Benjamin, and specifically, and all his brothers. Pharaoh finds out that there's a party going on at Joseph's house. He's excited. He has one Joseph, and now there's 12 of them. Can't believe his good fortune. They load up the animals. They go back to the land of Canaan. He gives them gifts, and he sends him 10 donkeys for his father, laden with all the best fruits of Egypt. And he instructs them, do not become agitated on the way. He realizes that there's going to be a lot of finger pointing going on post facto. Who was guilty, and who's responsible, and who's going to pay the price for it. He tells them, don't try to be so on the way. Don't argue about it, because you won't really get much productive results from that. They go and they arrive to Jacob. They tell him. He doesn't believe them initially. And they retell him everything. And finally he sees the wagons that Joseph sent, and his spirit was revived. And he exclaims, Jacob does, how great it is, my son Joseph is still alive. I'm going to go see him before I die. Jacob doesn't believe that Joseph is still alive. He doesn't believe it. And then finally, when he sees the wagons, then he believes it, and the spirit is a really strange sentence here. The Talmud tells us that all the way back when Jacob was still a 17-year-old, we're told that Jacob gave over all of his Torah to Joseph. And Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, we're told in the Talmud, he knew Torah even before it was given. They had access to Torah, a primitive form of Torah, or not a primitive form of Torah, but a form of Torah even before Sinai that was present in the collected knowledge of the Jewish people, starting with Abraham. The last bit of Torah that Jacob and Joseph had studied was the section of Egla Arufa, which means when someone dies and we don't know who, we just find a dead body, we don't know who killed him or how he died, and we don't know who's responsible. So we measure the distance of the corpse to the nearest city, and the people of that city, they have to undergo a process, or they have to do a process by which they kind of wash their hands from this tragedy. When someone dies, maybe they weren't fed properly, they came to the city, no one offered them food and water and provisions. So that's the law, and it's called Egla Rufa. Egla is the Hebrew word for a wagon as well. And therefore, the Talmud tells us is that when he sees the agalot, when he sees that, and he remembers that that's what the last thing they studied with Joseph, and Joseph's kind of sending him a subliminal message with, wink, wink, I'm still around, I'm still the same Joseph, that really revives him. So maybe it's possible that Jacob believed them. He didn't think they were lying. He knew Joseph was alive. But in Jacob's mind, and we'll see this again later, to be alive, to be breathing, that doesn't mean anything. What he was really concerned about is Joseph still alive spiritually? Is he still maintaining? He's a king in Egypt. Oy vey, what's going to be with him? Is he still the righteous Joseph? And that's what he didn't believe. And then he sees that Joseph is still referencing the Torah they studied 22 years ago, and he is mollified. And right away they plan their trip down to Egypt. And before they leave, Jacob brings sacrifices. And on verse 2 in chapter 46, God gives Jacob a prophecy, and he tells them, I am the God of your father. Have no fear in descending to Egypt, For I shall establish you as a great nation there. I shall descend with you to Egypt. I shall also surely bring you up, and Joseph shall place his hand on your eyes. So this is interesting. So we've mentioned already that Jacob did not have any prophecy for the entire duration of Joseph being gone. Right away, he finds that Joseph's still alive. Prophecy immediately resumes. But it's interesting to note that if you read the verse, it says, God spoke to Israel, to Jacob, in a night vision. So the prophecy was at night. Jacob is the only one of the forefathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that the verse explicitly says that he had prophecy at night. The previous time was when he was escaping from Esau and going to Laban. He had a nighttime prophecy with the ladder and the ascending and descending angels. So it's interesting that Jacob specifically is the one of the forefathers, or the only one of the forefathers, to whom prophecy, at least in these two instances, is doled out specifically at night. The question is why? And I think it's important to look at these two stories, these two episodes, and understand the context. Jacob, both times are Jacob leaving Israel. Initially, he's leaving Israel to escape from Esau and to head to Lavan. But he's going into exile. It's the Jewish people, they're in Israel, and they're leaving. Again, the Jewish people are in Israel, with the exception of Joseph and his family. And now everyone is leaving Canaan, leaving the homeland, leaving the promised land, and descending to Egypt, where they know it's not going to end up so well for them. It's almost as if it's night. It's exile. We don't have a clear connection, relationship with God in exile. And therefore, the Almighty is telling him, yes, it's nighttime, but even during the depths of despair of exile, I'm with you. I too shall go with you down to Egypt. Have no fear, descend to Egypt, for I shall establish you a great nation. I shall descend with you to Egypt. We're told in the Talmud that Abraham, he invented the Shacharis, the morning prayer, Isaac, the afternoon prayer, and Jacob, the evening prayer. Because Jacob is the one who represents nighttime and the challenges that we have when God is not as close and his presence is not as clear. That is what Jacob represents. Indeed, Jacob is the father of Jewish people. That's been our history for a long time. And specifically in the darkness at night, God says, I'm still with you. I'm heading down with you to Egypt. You may not see it in the depths of torment that you're going to experience in Egypt. You may not notice it, but I'm still there with you. And that indeed is comforting for us to know that when bad things happen to us, collectively and as individuals, it's important for us to realize that we are the nation of Israel. We come from Jacob. And Jacob also was told specifically that even though we're heading towards exile and we're heading towards darkness, God is still with us, and that's very comforting. This is the same lesson of Hanukkah. Hanukkah was a ray of light in a sea of darkness. We were under Greek occupation, but before that we were under occupation of others. Eventually we were passed on to the Romans and passed on to the Byzantines, to the Ottomans and the Mamelukes and everyone else. And that's what Hanukkah really represents. Hanukkah represents that even though we are immersed in exile, we still have this light, so to speak, in the darkness. So Jacob and his family and his children and grandchildren, they all get into the wagons that Pharaoh sent. They take all their animals and their livestock, all their wealth that they had amassed. And the Torah begins to count the names of this procession. And it goes through all the names, and it breaks it down in the four families of Jacob, Jacob's four wives, 33 for Leah, 16 for Zilpah, 7 for Bilhah, and 14 for Rachel. And the total is 70. Now it's interesting, if you actually count the names, you only end up with 69, because there's only 32 in the family of Leah, not 33. But the truth is that these were the ones who left Israel, who left Canaan, but one of them was born. There was a baby born right on the doorstep of Egypt, and that's Yocheved, who is going to be the mother of Moses. So this is interesting here. So Yocheved is born in the doorsteps between the walls of Egypt, which is an interesting terminology that the Talmud uses. That between the walls is like kind of on the transition into Egypt, she's born. The question is, why does it have to happen like that? Like, why does it have to be that she's born, like right as they're transitioning into Egypt, she's born? Like, so they stopped along the way and said, okay, now we need a midwife because there's a baby being born. Oh, we're between the walls. It seems very strange. I think the idea is that whenever God is about to smite the Jewish people, there's always going to be the remedy before the wound. That's the way God works with us. The remedy always precedes the wound. The Jewish people, even though they're heading, the nascent Jewish people, even though they're heading to Egypt as, the protected people, family of Joseph, they're going to end up being enslaved in Egypt. But we know the stories that Moshe is going to lead them out of Egypt. So before God places Jewish people in the plight that's going to befall them, he has to already start planning, so to speak, the remedy in the form of Moses. And therefore, Moses' mother had to be born before they actually entered. Zionism reached a crescendo 50 years before the Holocaust. And all the groundwork was laid for a political movement never seen in the world before that just springs out of nothing in the late 19th century and causes masses of migrants to go to Israel and to start building up the infrastructure before the destruction of the Jewish epicenter in Europe. It's kind of similar. And it's also, I think this sentiment is echoed as well in verse 28. So verse 28 here says that Judah was sent ahead of them to the land of Goshen, and then everyone else came to the land of Goshen. So Judah is sent before them to do something. So Rashi tells us that Judah was sent ahead of the crowd in order to establish some basic Jewish infrastructure. Maybe a Jewish school, a synagogue, a yeshiva, something to ensure that there is something, that there is a necessary infrastructure for a viable Jewish community in Egypt, which is again similar to that idea that there's always we have to prepare before something actually happens, where there's a shift. There has to be something, the groundwork has to be laid for Jewish continuity. There's a historical parallel to this, where 10 years before the destruction of the first temple, Nebuchadnezzar, he sends as hostages 10,000 people from Judah, which is Israel or Canaan, those names are interchangeable, at least geographically. He sends 10,000, including the prophet Ezekiel, in chains, really, to Babylon as hostages to prevent eruption of revolt from the Jewish people. And to look at the best and brightest of the Jewish people being sent away is very disconcerting. But the Talmud tells us is that this is God's, once again, preparing the remedy before the wound. The wound is coming. The destruction of the temple and the destruction of the Jewish life in Israel is pending. It's 10 years away. We don't know that because we don't have the same foresight and vision. But God prepares what's going to be a very viable and vibrant Jewish community in Babylon by sending the best and brightest to establish the groundwork for Jewish civilization in Babylon, and that way when the masses arrive, they find the infrastructure that can maintain a viable Jewish community for a very long period that people are going to be in Babylon. The people in Babylon for about almost 2,500 years, long time, that there's a Jewish center in Babylon. And during much of that time, it's actually not a Jewish center, it's the Jewish center of Jewish life. Now, it's interesting, in 1880, there was a huge migration of Russian and German Jews to the United States. The initial influx of masses of Jewish immigrants to the United States was in the early part of the 1880s. And when they came to America, they did not find a viable Jewish infrastructure. It was, there weren't schools, there weren't kosher food establishments, there wasn't synagogue. There were a few, but it wasn't enough, and that's why we see, the American Jewry really, went assimilated en masse, in huge numbers, because there wasn't this Judah being sent ahead, or this plan for preparation of the ground for viable Jewish life, which is why there was a lot of resistance. People believed in Europe that if you leave Europe and you leave Poland or you leave Lithuania, you leave Belarus, you leave these places where there's strong Jewish environments, and you go to America, you're done. Because people would go to America, they could be pious, but they get to America and they have to work on Shabbos. There's no option to not work on Shabbos. And what happens? They just lose they start systematically becoming acculturated and assimilated, and they're gone. And that's indeed unfortunately happened. Now, thank God it's not like that anymore, but we see the importance of having a Jewish infrastructure for where someone can live. In fact, Maimonides tells us someone is not allowed to live in a city where there's not a Jewish school. Because what happens if you don't have a Jewish school? How do you educate your children? How do you do it? How do you do it? You can't. So it's the number one responsibility. You have to live in a place where there's a school, there's a shul, there has to be, or else what's going to be with the future of the Jewish people? How could they possibly survive and thrive when there isn't the very basic infrastructure that allows that to happen? Now, so Judah sent ahead, the family is all heading down, and Joseph harnesses his chariot to go meet Jacob. And they have this really fateful encounter. Jacob, they see each other, Joseph falls on his neck, and he cries and he hugs him. And it's interesting that this is somewhat of a one-person show. While Joseph is emotionally hugging and kissing his father, Jacob appears to be stoic. All we hear about is Joseph. And there's a very famous teaching in the Talmud that Jacob wasn't hugging and kissing Joseph because he was saying the Shema prayer. It's a really strange idea because the Shema prayer is said twice a day, in the morning and at night. We already know about Joseph that he maintained his Jewish character even though he was immersed amongst the Gentiles. So if it was the correct time to say Shema, they both should have been saying the Shema. If it was not the correct time to say the Shema, so why was Jacob saying the Shema? Either they both should have said it, or neither should have said it. That's the question. And a lot of answers given. So there's a very famous answer given by the Maharal where he says that Jacob, after all, he was the father who didn't know that his son was alive. So his joy was much greater than Joseph's joy. Joseph knew his father was alive all the time, all along. And plus, the love of a father to a child exceeds that of a child to a father. So Jacob has more joy, and Jacob wants to inject the joy into a mitzvah. He has love that is bursting forth. He wants to inject that love into the first sentence of the Shema, to love God. That's a famous answer given. My grandfather, in one of his books, he gives a really interesting another answer here. We're told in the Talmud that the Avos, the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are the chariot of God. What this means is that a chariot is always ready for the rider, and the rider decides whether he wants the chariot. So when one of the forefathers has prophecy, that is God choosing to speak to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're always ready for prophecy. Whereas earlier in Genesis, we meet Cain. Cain descends from God. The reason why the prophecy ceased was not because of God removing himself, but because the receptacle, the vessel for prophecy, is being demoted and downgraded to no longer being capable of prophecy. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob always maintained a constant ready state of prophecy should God want to talk to them. Now that is a product of focus, of preparation, of vigilance to always be at a ready state of prophecy. What happens when someone is encountering a love of such intensity that can make someone for a second almost forget about God? Jacob knew this was a problem because he didn't want to have his stature lessened. Therefore, as a way of preempting the perceived loss of spiritual readiness, Jacob says the Shema. Shema is the intellectual affirmation of God's presence, and therefore he's counteracting the negative effect that it would have on his spiritual readiness for prophecy. Jacob was at a very high level of spiritual readiness. He didn't want to lose that, not for a second, and therefore he ensured that he would say Shema right when he meets Joseph and thus maintain his level. So the Talmud in the book of Brachos on page 5a tells us that the best gold standard for resisting the Yetzer Hara, for defeating the Yetzer Hara, is to agitate it with the Yetzer Tov, which means to convert the evil inclination to a good inclination. If your enemy is suddenly your ally, you don't have a battle. That's the best way. If that doesn't work, says the Talmud, someone should study Torah. Because studying Torah makes you rise above your Yetzer Hara and not be subject to a battle. If that doesn't work, someone should read the Shema.
Or say it.
Yeah, read the Shema, say the Shema. If that doesn't work, someone should remind him of the day of death. That's guaranteed to work. That's the poison pill.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you remind your Yetzer Hara of the day of death, it chokes life out of its influences. That's the Gemara in Brachos on page 5a. And these are ways to defeat it, to prevent the battle. So Joseph and his brothers, they arrive, they settle down in the land of Goshen. They're somewhat secluded from the rest of the Egyptians, especially because they're shepherds, and the Egyptians, they deified cattle, strangely enough, and therefore Joseph wanted to highlight that to make sure that they got their seclusion and they wouldn't be adversely influenced by their neighbors. A contingency of the brothers go meet Pharaoh, and Joseph tells them beforehand, be very careful, because he likes me a lot, and he would love nothing more than to have a whole band of brothers to work in the government, and Joseph does not want that. So he tells them again, make sure you tell Pharaoh that you're just simple farmers. And actually what he selects here, he selects from the least of his brothers. He took 5 of his brothers that were the least imposing. Who are these 5 brothers? Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yisachar, and Benjamin. So think about it. The least of the 5 brothers include Shimon and Levi, who slaughtered a whole town. These were the more minor brothers, they're not so imposing. They're the ones who can maybe pass off as simple farmers and simple shepherds. But the rest of them, then Pharaoh would automatically know that these are much more than just simple shepherds. They successfully managed to be allowed to be settled in Goshen. And then Jacob meets Pharaoh. And Jacob blesses Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asks the strange question, how old are you? Remember, Pharaoh is the one who had the birthday. He obviously is interested in this question. And Jacob, we know, is 130 years old as he answers. So I guess Jacob looked really old, and he was asked by Pharaoh, how old are you? And Jacob's response really needs to be analyzed. Jacob answered Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourns have been 130 years. Few and bad have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not reached the lifespan of my forefathers in the days of their sojourns. A really strange sentence here. He is making distinctions between days of sojourns and days of life. So he says, my days of sojourns, which is how long have I been breathing, 130 years. But the days of my life is very few. And the ratio of days of life vis-a-vis days of sojourns don't approach the days of life in the days of sojourns of my forefathers. What he's telling us is that there's two kinds of life. There's life, which is you're alive, you're breathing, there's brain activity, and there's spiritual life, where you're actually alive. And for some of us, who knows, maybe we're alive for 10 minutes, where we're doing really mitzvos, some people. Maybe people are alive for 10 years. They live for 90 years. The days of their sojourns are 90, but the days of real life is how long they were studying Torah and doing mitzvos. In fact, part of the evening prayer is that we say about Torah, Kihem chayenu v'orech yameinu. Torah is our life and the length of our days. What this means is that there's two counters. You look at your ID, it says when you were born. That's the days of sojourns. But the days of your life, well, how's that measured? There's a totally different clock that's counting up the actual years of life. And Jacob is lamenting the fact that his actual life doesn't approach the life of his forefathers. When Abraham dies, the Torah testifies upon him that all of his 175 years were real life. What it's saying is that he maximized his days of sojourn to make sure the days of sojourn were all days of life. And it does the same thing with Jacob as well, but his personal perspective is that it's not quite like that. Now, if you count the number of words that Pharaoh tells Jacob and Jacob tells Pharaoh, the number is 33. Now, we know that Jacob dies at the age of 147. So the time span of all of the forefathers was Abraham was 175, Isaac was 180, and Jacob was 147. Why is there a disparity? So we're told that all of them were destined to live for 180. And that's why Isaac lived for 180. Abraham died 5 years before he should have died because God promised him that you will die, with everything, all your accounts being settled. Everything will be good. When Esau went awry, Esau is Abraham's grandson. When he started going off, that was when Abraham was 175. God promised Abraham that he will die and things will be good. Therefore, he had to die before things started going bad. One of his grandsons started misbehaving. In fact, when Jacob is preparing the lentils are traditional food of mourning because they're circular. And the idea is that, when life, things go up and things go down, but there's a cycle. And Esau comes in and he's tired, he's spiritually exhausted because he just started going off on the wrong path. The reason why Jacob is cooking the lentils because Abraham had died, and that's the food of mourning. And the reason why he had to die early was because Esau was going off. Jacob died at 147. He died 33 years before he should have died. And the reason why is because of these 33 words of this encounter. Jacob is complaining about his life, and therefore because he's complaining about your life, that's going to deduct from your life as well. And now what's interesting is that Jacob is penalized not only for his words, but for Pharaoh's words as well. Apparently, Pharaoh, when Pharaoh was asking the question, that was being prompted by what he saw in Jacob. Jacob gave off an appearance, a sad appearance about his life that prompted Pharaoh to ask, how old are you? And for him to launch into this, this lamentation about, well, my life is not that good and things aren't that great. So therefore, Jacob is penalized not only for his complaining about his life, but also about the appearance that he gave off that other people picked up upon and prompted their question, which brought about his response, which really shows us about Jacob's greatness. The only thing that could have deducted possibly from his righteousness is this story where he is complaining about his life. And by the way, even when he is complaining about his life, we learn a very valuable lesson. We learn about what life really is. It's not just breathing. You could invent a computer program that simulates breathing and brain activity. You could do that. That's not life. Life is where your soul is alive. Your body's alive, that's no big deal. To make your soul alive, that's a challenge. That's a very valuable lesson. Even though Jacob taught us a very valuable lesson, because there is an element of complaining, you don't want life, your life is not that great. Oh, you don't want to live so much? Okay, we'll deduct 1 year for every word of complaining. Okay, so the Parsha ends with detailing what Joseph's integrity and diligence while working for Pharaoh. They gathered all the money. Once all the money was gone, they gathered all the livestock because people need food and they'll sell whatever it is. When all the livestock is owned by Pharaoh, they start buying all the land. They acquired all the land, and what Joseph did to ensure that people recognized the land belonged to Pharaoh is that he resettled the cities. If I keep you on your land and you're working for Pharaoh, you still feel an ownership interest, proprietary interest. This is my land. It's been part of my family for a long time. What Joseph did instead is he resettled everyone, moved everyone around. They weren't in the environment that they are accustomed to, to believe that they're owners of it, and that way they know they're all working for Pharaoh. Pharaoh would take a cut of everyone's worth. They'd be sharecroppers for him. And this really shows, I think, the story, the Torah is going out of its way to tell us the detail of the story. The Ramban tells us is that this is to show how Joseph, how committed he was, as we've seen with every stage of his life, that when he gets committed to something, he does it entirely and perfectly. Even though, Pharaoh has all the money, he has all the livestock, he has everything. What else could he need? Now maybe give the people a freebie. No, well, if they're working for Pharaoh, this was the deal. This is the deal. And indeed, that they should, Joseph's responsibility to his shareholders, so to speak. He is tasked with a job, and he has to do his job, and that even though you would say, well, okay, maybe take the pedal, the foot off the gas a little bit, The truth is, no, your job is to do your job, and Joseph's job was to be the fiduciary of Pharaoh in oversight of Egypt, and he had to act in Pharaoh's best interest. And we see today, like to us, this is unimaginable, inconceivable to have a public servant that's so dedicated to their task that bribes are not interested in bribes, not interested in skimming a little bit. We've already become accustomed to the fact that there's a certain little kind of the fat, to the tune of a couple $1 billion a year, maybe $100 billion a year, that are just unaccounted for. They're just part of slush funds. They're just gone. They just had a story in the Wall Street Journal that there's $125 billion missing from the Pentagon's budget. That no one knows where it is. No one has any clue where it is. It's gone. I'll tell you exactly where it is. It's lining the coffers, lining the pockets of corrupt officials. And we're not bothered by that. $125 million, even by any standard, it's a lot of money. It's chump change maybe for the government, but it's still a lot of money, right? That was one of the lines. One of the politicians said, "A billion here, a billion there." Sooner or later, you talk about real money. So, but that's what we've become accustomed to, and Joseph is not like that. Joseph is someone that is entirely dedicated to his task. The family of Joseph, the family of Jacob, they settle down in the land, and they grow and they become fruitful and they multiply, and there they're going to be for 200 years. And in next week's parsha, we're going to meet the end of Jacob and the death of Jacob's children, and eventually the shift in the way of life of the Jews in Egypt.